Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so getting into House of X Part 3, this story is amazing because what this does is this really gives us like the origin of the Nimrod from Powers of X, which really sort of changes everything that we've known about the Nimrod Sentinels, which is the other big thing. Hickman takes everything that we know about Nimrods and then turns it on its head. And it's a cool idea. Like I actually really dig what it is that he's doing here, but we'll make this all make sense, especially when we talk about master molds. When he gives us this kind of hierarchy, we'll do an explanation on him, on the concept of a master mold, different things like that. But this initially picks up with Cyclops. Now, remember, up until about issue number 2, or really issue number 3 of Powers of X, we didn't really know how everything unfolded. Like it was really Hickman just kind of setting the stage and showing us what was going on. The way this works here is it seems as though Powers of X basically feeds into House of X. They're not two distinctly different stories happening at the same time. It's not like one focuses on the future, the other one focuses on the present day and the past. Instead, you're talking about like two things, like one that feeds the other. And so Powers of X really seems to just kind of follow the lives of Moira McTaggart, right? I mean, issues 1 through 3 were basically showing us the future where Apocalypse launches an attack against the Sentinel bases of Earth in order to capture information or to attain information on the origin of Nimrod, which is handed over to Moira McTaggart. And because every time she dies, she goes back to the moment when she was reborn and lives her life over again, what it's done is it allows her to basically gather as much information as she can to ensure the future survival of mutants, right? So she ended up taking the partial information on the origin of Nimrod and then bring it back with her so that when she dies, she has that information when she reincarnates, and that's where we are right now in House of X. And so it's the X-Men basically taking the information that was gained by Moira McTaggart at the end of Powers of X number 3 and then launching an attempt to destroy Nimrod before he's ever really created, right? Like to prevent his creation. And it's kind of a cool thing because Cyclops is scared out of his wits, right? And that makes sense because what you're talking about here is you're talking about the ultimate Sentinel. It's a Sentinel designed to basically counter all form of superpowers and then destroy those superpowered beings, right? So while I don't necessarily agree with the idea that Apocalypse cannot defeat Nimrod, at the same time, it also kind of makes sense, right? Because it would defeat the purpose of Nimrod if Nimrod somehow encountered a Earth-based being that he couldn't defeat. But basically, it's Magneto trying to assure Cyclops, at the end of the day, you're an idea. The attempt to basically keep the mutant population alive. And so even if you go here and even if you die, you will never truly die because one, ideas never die, and as a founder of a nation, founders are never forgotten. If you end up perishing on this mission, for generations from now, people will remember your name. They'll remember the effort you put in. Now, for Cyclops, it actually works because what Hickman has done and what's been going on with Cyclops ever since his return after the events of Phoenix Resurrection is that he's gone back to being the guy who champions the cause of Charles Xavier. And so it's a cool little moment here because it's basically Cyclops saying, yes, like that works for me. And so what he ends up doing, of course, is walking through one of these teleporters and traveling to the blue area of the moon, and then in turn speaking with the X-Men and letting them know what's going on. And that what's happening here, of course, is as we're aware, there's Orcus, right? This government organization composed of a myriad of different groups, Hydra, Advanced Idea Mechanics, things like that. It really serves a purpose of basically just like coming together and finding a way to control the mutant threat, right? So like Project Wide Awake at its most extreme, right? Like contain, control, and if necessary, eradicate the mutant threat. And so what humanity's been doing is they're creating a mother mold designed to create other master molds for the purpose of basically creating Sentinels at an exponential rate. And what Hickman does here is he basically gives us this progression from a baseline Sentinel to Nimrod. What he does is he kind of takes all the information that we've had and not really flying in the face of it so much as just kind of expanding it out. So in Marvel Comics, for years and years and years, Nimrod was considered the ultimate Sentinel, right? The idea was that in the Days of Future Past timeline, Sentinels were constantly improving on themselves, right? Like creating new versions of themselves until they got to the point where they could create Nimrod, a Sentinel that can shapeshift, a Sentinel that can basically detect the weaknesses of mutants and then use that to its advantage, that could detect their powers and then find ways to overcome their powers. It could adapt. It had all these different capabilities, all these things that it could do that made it like this living powerhouse. Now, the way it was originally designed, Nimrods were governed by their programming, right? Like that was it. It was simply their programming and that's all there was to it. That changed when Nimrod came to the main Marvel universe, left the Days of Future Past universe and came to the main Marvel universe. Then it kind of forgot its programming and went and started doing what it thought was the right thing to do, which I think for a little while was actually becoming not really a hero, but kind of an anti-hero. It was kind of weird the way that it played out back in the day. But all Sentinels were basically governed by programming and they couldn't deviate beyond that programming. What this does is it says, okay, so there's your baseline Sentinel, right? So these are the ones from Days of Future Past, the ones ones that you recognize from X-Men, the animated series. These are your straight line Sentinels, the most popular versions of this, this type of machinery. Then you go into master molds, and master molds basically are replicating machiners, right? Like they basically create Sentinels. That's their purpose, right? You go back and you look at X-Men issue number 15. They were created by Bolivar Trask, originally by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. And then in turn, when Bolivar Trask was defeated, the master mold and the Sentinel concept was handed over to Stephen Lang, and Stephen Lang started creating more Sentinels, right? And the idea behind this was that creating Sentinels by hand was too tedious and too time consuming. For Bolivar Trask, it simply just took too long. So why not create a giant machine that in turn will create Sentinels, create one like every 5 to 10 minutes or something along those lines, and basically just like crank them out as fast as humanly possible. It was basically a way to mass produce Sentinels at a very accelerated rate. Now, from the master mold, you go into the mother mold, which is what Hickman is giving us here. And a mother mold is basically a replicating adaptive Sentinel factory, right? It's basically a master mold, and it's self-aware like a master mold is, insofar that if there's a scenario of danger and the master mold cannot overcome that danger, it will leave and go somewhere else to where it can start, it can continue creating Sentinels. A mother mold will do the exact same thing. It'll do whatever it needs to do to eliminate threats to its existence so it can continue with its programming and creating Sentinels. The funny thing about this is that where a master mold can never do anything but make Sentinels, a mother mold, it's believed, can actually progress to the point where it can create something better than Sentinels, right? It can create like purely adaptable machines based on nano Sentinel technology. That's what Hickman tells us, that basically it can create Omega Sentinels, and it can do this by creating by using like nano Sentinel tech and putting it into human beings. Now, master mold was originally able to do that. It wasn't until the later years so I guess not really originally, but it wasn't until the later years when you got into like the late 90s and the early 2000s that a master mold was able to do that, create like Omega Sentinels, right? So really in the early to early 90s to the early 2000s. But this is something that really seems to be ascribed explicitly to the mother mold. The mother mold is the only one that can basically create like Omega Sentinels. Now from there, you go into the definition of an Omega Sentinel, right? And we've talked about that before. Omega Sentinels are basically humans that have been merged with nano Sentinel technology, right? So for those of you guys who ever watched Star Trek, think of the Borg. The difference is that there is a kind of progression when it comes to that. And we'll talk about that, later on in this video. But then you go into basically a Nimrod. And this is where Hickman is changing things, because instead of simply saying Nimrod, he's saying a Nimrod. And this is basically a pure nano Sentinel construct, right? So anti-mutant, adaptive, self-aware, self-replicating, virtually indestructible. What Hickman seems to be saying here is that an Omega Sentinel is the logical conclusion to a Nimrod, right? So like depending on what's going on, that you basically have a baseline Sentinel, which in turn is created by master molds, which in turn is created by mother molds, which are capable of creating Omega Sentinels, which will turn into Nimrods. What he does next is he basically says that a Nimrod is an end state. It's a conclusion to the progression of a Omega Sentinel, is basically what that is. And so it's kind of a cool idea here, because when you look at this for what it is, it turns into this neat idea, like this really neat concept, because then he goes into the Omega Sentinel process, right? Like the system by which these Sentinels exist, right? And so a person is initially infected, and then the nano Sentinels basically infest the human host, right? They basically start replicating all over the place and infest this person, and then they lay dormant for some time, depending on when it is they need to be activated, right? So like when they're infected in there, like the mother mold may create them and say, okay, these Sentinel genes or these Sentinel nano Sentinel tech pieces are going to become activated in like 10 years, right? And then when that happens, they're basically activated. Or it can activate them right off the spot, like right off the bat. Whatever the case is, when activation takes place, then in turn, like the person starts to become converted, right? So activation happens, and then a union takes place, right? Where the human becomes aware of this, kind of voice in the back of their head, basically these Sentinel directives that are being given to the nano Sentinel tech inside their body. And then in turn, the nanotech totally integrates into the human being, and it takes over them. And then eventually they're totally a machine state, right? They're completely and totally taken over by the nanotech, and there's no real shred of human being left. And they basically become a Nimrod. It's cool. Like it's a cool concept. But at this point, we switch over to what's called Project Achilles. Now, Project Achilles is kind of like this government sanctioned supervillain prison with regards to like mutants. It seems almost explicitly for mutants, but for individuals with superpowers, right? So like the next stage of the Raft prison off the coast of New York or whatever it was, before it was destroyed during the events of Brian Michael Bendis' New Avengers. And so what happens here is you basically have a mutant that's brought before the court, and essentially this is a kangaroo court, right? Like his guilt has already been determined. The court's kind of like, what does a public defender have to say? But it doesn't really matter, right? Because it's like there's a 12 strikes rule. And the 12 strikes rule is that if you commit an illegal act 12 times, then regardless of your intention, whether you were tricked into it or not, you're thrown in jail. And we end up learning, of course, that this mutant is none other than Sabretooth. And it's kind of cool because Sabretooth is like, yeah, man, I'm guilty. Like I've done all these things. Like everything you accuse me of, I've done. And I don't really regret it. Like I don't really feel that bad about it because like, what does it matter? Like, you got people here with guns, but I got a healing factor. Who cares? I could tear through everybody in this room it's one of the reasons why I love Sabretooth. Hickman is doing 1980s Sabretooth. Let me tell you something about 1980s Sabretooth. That version of Sabretooth back in the day, he would have killed everybody in this room and been home in time for cornflakes. He was awesome. And so it's this cool moment here, because as he's kind of sitting there, like of course his senses pick up on the smell of jasmine, and this entire court is met by the arrival of Emma Frost. And this is probably one of the coolest moments in the entire story, because Emma Frost comes walking in, and this is kind of the cool moment. What I was expecting her to do was shut down everyone, right? Because Emma Frost is an Omega level telepath. I guess maybe now she's not really considered Omega level according to Jonathan Hickman, but she's an exceedingly powerful telepath. She walks in, she can dominate the minds of everybody in this room, but she doesn't. Instead, she uses the law on her side. And the reason why is because if she walked in here and dominated the minds of everyone and then took Sabretooth, it'd be a prison break. Instead, she comes out and she says, we as Krakoa are a sovereign nation. We enjoy diplomatic immunity. Every mutant on the face of the planet is a citizen of Krakoa. Therefore, every mutant on the face of the planet has diplomatic immunity in human court systems. Therefore, you cannot put Sabretooth on trial because he is outside your purview. He's beyond you, right? You can't touch this guy. To hold him on trial is to do this illegally. Like, you're basically committing an illegal act by doing this. And so it's kind of a funny little thing, because she's like, we have all the paperwork that you need, or at least the Stepford Cuckoos tell, her clones basically are like, we have all the information that you need. Like, we have all the paperwork and everything. Everything that we're doing is above board. We're not cheating the law. We're not skirting the rules or anything like that. Everything we're doing here is in the confines of the law. So legally, you have to release Sabretooth, or what you're doing is defying the United States Defense Department, in which case we'll take the whole thing to court. It's using the legal system as a means to basically circumvent everything. And it's kind of funny because there's this chick here who points a gun at Emma Frost, right? And, she says, like, under any normal circumstance, I would basically trick you into believing that, well, I won't go into that, but basically I would take away your ability to shoot me. For lack of a better word. And so it's this amazing moment, right? Because she's like, I've learned to understand that diplomacy is really the way to go. So here's what we're gonna do. You're gonna put your gun away and you're gonna let me leave with Sabretooth, and I'm going to pretend like you could have stopped me. And like, that'll be it. Dude, it's one of the coolest things, right? Because like, this chick never could have stopped Emma Frost. Emma Frost could have made this chick believe that she was a rabbit and have her spend the rest of her life hopping around on all four legs, right? Like eating carrots. Like that would have been her life from that point going forward, right? Like she would have spent the rest of her life believing she was SpongeBob SquarePants and walking around singing the theme song. Like Emma Frost could totally scramble this chick's brain. And that's why it's so awesome, is because I love the way that Hickman writes this. I love the way Hickman does these things. And so what we end up doing is transitioning to Orcus Forge. Now, this is one of the reasons why Hickman writing is so awesome, because everything intertwines. Everything ties into everything else. That's why, like, truthfully speaking, if all you wanted to do was read Jonathan Hickman, right? You start with his Fantastic Four run, and then you go into his Secret Warriors. You can read S.H.I.E.L.D. if you want like basically the origins of S.H.I.E.L.D. And then you go into like Avengers and New Avengers. You read all those books. Like if you read them in chronological order, it's one giant cohesive story, and it all fits in perfect. You could literally ignore everything else in Marvel Comics, and like, you would be fine. You would not be confused. It would all make sense. That's why Hickman writing is so cool, because when you look at this, you have these panels that basically orbit the sun. Those are the panels that Tony Stark was working on during the incursions, during the events of Avengers and New Avengers. So it's kind of a cool thing here, because in turn, what you have is you basically have like all of this, like humanity's basically built this giant forge in the wake of Saul's hammer. That was basically the way it was. Like Saul's anvil was Fantastic Four. Saul's hammer was the name of the giant Dyson sphere that Tony Stark was building around the sun in order to like destroy and curse of Earths during Avengers and New Avengers. So again, all of Hickman's stuff builds onto itself. The issue with this is that while they're working on building this giant mother mold that's going to start creating master molds, the problem they run into is the X-Men arrive. Because what humanity did not count on was the X-Men getting information from Moira McTaggart from what was essentially the future in order to learn what it is that they're doing in the past. And so they really kind of panic, and they really kind of freak out, because they're like, we weren't expecting this. Now, remember, Omega is still here, which means Omega, of course, she's the chick that basically operates alongside Nimrod during Powers of X, the one that you see who's basically red with like the machinery looking stuff on her face. That's her. The real question to ask here, and this is the big question that I want to know if Hickman's going to answer: can you have more than one Nimrod? Is a Nimrod considered to be like a queen bee of a beehive, right? You can only ever have one queen. I wonder if that's the case. Like when it comes to Nimrod, there's only ever one Nimrod at a time. I'm curious if that's the case or not. So of course the X-Men basically trying to get the information they need, send in Nightcrawler, because Nightcrawler's the best bet, right? He can teleport in, teleport around. Humanity won't be able to catch up to him. He can grab the information he needs, and then you can basically find a way for the X-Men, like where they need to dock and where they need to get in, and then in turn they can launch their mission. Now, the funny thing about this is that the X-Men are still trying to maintain this idea that there are innocents here, that they're basically like contractors, government workers, different things like that. And so not everybody on this facility is guilty. But the reality is that even if they're not necessarily guilty, like they're working alongside the guilty party. And so they're guilty by association. So you got to do them away anyway. You know, it's kind of the nature of the beast. That's the way it goes. And so as a result of this, what you end up having here is you end up having a guy named Erasmus. Now, Erasmus Mendel is like a new guy here, right? Like we don't really know anything about him. Like, I mean, he's literally introduced in Hickman's House of X series. And so usually Hickman does things like this because they serve a particular purpose. In this instance, like Erasmus basically looks at that and says like, they're basically getting ready to board here. We have to stop them from being able to get information about like the mother mold, right? Because the mother mold is currently learning. It's currently learning all these bits of information and all these things so that when humanity activates it, it doesn't do Days of Future Past where it sits around and says humans and mutants. Okay, so mutants come from humans, therefore mutants are human, hence all humans and mutants need to be subjugated under the power of the Sentinels because my programming says mutants need to be contained and controlled. When mutants are humans, all humans and mutants get contained and controlled. That instead of having to move to that logical conclusion, it can use what's basically called nuance. And so it's kind of a cool little thing here because what ends up happening is Erasmus basically says like, we can't let them win. Do not let the mutants get all this information that they need. And he basically blows himself up. And so what this seems to do, or at least he detonates and with the intention of destroying the X-Men ship, what this seems to do is set the stage for basically his wife becoming like this new rabid anti-mutant supporter and really kind of moving forward at a far more rapid pace and basically speeding up the creation of the mother mold. In effect, what this seems to do is that by the X-Men launching their attack and trying to find a way to overtake and to take out the mother mold, what they've done is sped up their own execution, like their own destruction, by creating a far more rabid enemy than they had before. It's kind of cool, and it's a pretty awesome concept. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.